G'day and welcome to the program. I'm David Lipson. It's been a big week in federal politics, the rejection of a foreign takeover bid of GrainCorp and a major shift on schools funding. And next week, a lot of attention turns to the Senate here in Canberra, where it's crunch time for the carbon tax and the debt ceiling. To discuss all of this, I'm joined now here in the Canberra studio by the Finance Minister, Senator Mathias Cormann. Thanks for your time. Great to have you in the person. First to GrainCorp. Shares plummeted 22% yesterday. But more broadly, business is not happy with the decision, it seems. The Australian Industry Group, the Business Council and also the foreign investment community. Has Joe Hockey's first sort of big decision sent the wrong message to business?
Well, Joe Hockey assessed all of the issues and he made a judgment in the national interest. Now, the truth is, whatever decision he made, somebody was going to be unhappy. But, I mean, it's his job under the law to make those judgments. He made the judgment and he made it for the right reasons. And, I mean, that's where we are.
Isn't foreign investment exactly what Australia needs right now?
Well, Australia absolutely needs foreign investment. We've always relied on foreign investment for economic development. Foreign investment will be important moving forward. Out of 131 applications that have come before Joe Hockey, he's approved 130 of them. And of course, part of the reason, and he spelled that out in his statement of reasons that he released yesterday, part of the reason for the decision he made in relation to GrainCorp was exactly that, the importance of foreign investment and the importance to maintain public support for foreign investment into the future. And so, I mean, he clearly had a responsibility to assess all of the issues. He did that and he made a judgment in the national interest, and now we move forward.
That public support was diminished, you'd have to say, by the Nationals' campaign against GrainCorp or the takeover bid. Does that mean that if the Nationals make enough noise, enough threats in future, that the government, that Joe Hockey would capitulate?
Well, I mean, don't be too... Firstly, I mean, Joe Hockey made a decision based on the way he assessed and saw the issues. But in terms of the views taken by Nationals and a number of rural Liberals, for that matter, too, they don't take those views out of fun. They take those views because they represent a view across their communities, and of course, I mean, you can't ignore community views entirely when you're a politician. I mean, you've got to actually take community views into account. I mean, that is of course what Joe Hockey reflected in his statement too. I mean, there is a strong. This has obviously been a contentious issue. There is a strong view in a large section of regional Australia, and of course that was one of the concerns, the division and the lack of public support that might come if that particular application had been allowed to proceed.
Will this be a factor, do you think, when other global businesses consider Australia's risk profile?
Well, I mean, foreign investment applications are assessed on a case-by-case basis. It really, I mean, you can't draw any conclusions from one decision in relation to other applications that would come before government. The Treasurer will make these judgments in the national interest every time these applications come before him, and it really depends on the individual circumstances in any particular case.
Okay, well, Qantas needs help as well. Would you consider easing foreign ownership restrictions? It seems like Tony Abbott's ruled that out.
Well, I mean, there is a conversation to be had about whether the restrictions on Qantas in the Qantas Sale Act are still appropriate in a new competitive environment. You know, obviously the aviation industry globally is very competitive, has faced a series of challenges in recent years, and of course has gone through a lot of change. And the Qantas Sale Act restrictions on Qantas come from a different era, and there is a conversation to be had as to whether they're still contemporary. And if the view is that those restrictions should remain the way they are, then obviously there is a price that comes with that, and the community needs to be very conscious of that.
Do you have a personal view on that?
I'm a minister as part of the Abbott government. I don't have personal views on these things. Okay. We consider these issues very carefully and methodically as a team.
So then what about some of the other options, some form of government guarantee, for example, like the banks had during the GFC?
Look, we want Qantas, obviously, to continue to be strong and to prosper. You know, if there are proposals that are put before us, we'll consider them and we'll make these judgments at the right time in the context of any proposals that come our way.
And the only other option being mooted at the moment is a partial buyback of Qantas up to 10%.
I'm not going to start speculating on what the government may or may not do in relation to a hypothetical request which isn't before us.
Okay, just on schools, the Coalition insists that the same funding envelope will apply to school education funding. But since several states didn't sign up to Gonski, will those states be getting some of the funds from the states that did sign up? Will there be a reallocation?
Well, a couple of points here. Firstly, Bill Shorten left the school funding system in a complete mess, and Christopher Pyne is now sorting out the mess that Bill Shorten left behind. We are the national government. Christopher Pyne is the National Education Minister, and we have a responsibility to make sure that the school funding system is fair and truly national. What the previous government did, they signed up to a couple of deals and then ripped $1.2 billion of funding away from schools in Western Australia, Queensland and the Northern Territory. That is not fair. We understand, obviously, that it's going to take a while to work through these issues. So what we've said is that, yes, we are committed to the same funding envelope as we said before the election. When it comes to schools funding, we're actually doing better than what Labor would have done by putting an additional $230 million on the table for 2014 in order to provide appropriate funding to all schools in all states while we're working our way through a more appropriate school funding formula moving forward.
That's in the first year, that $240 million. $230 million. After that, 2015 onwards, again, will there be a reallocation from those states? Because they say they say that the Commonwealth has indicated that they'll lose out some of the money they were promised by Labor.
Well, Labor has ripped $1.2 billion of school funding away from children in Western Australia, Queensland and the Northern Territory, and they've entered some deals in relation to schools in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania and South Australia. Our responsibility as a national government is to make sure that we've got a school funding system that is truly national and that is fair nationally. So, of course, we're going to have to work our way through the implications of Bill Shorten's decision to rip $1.2 billion of schools funding away out of the system. So in order to give us some flexibility and some time to do that in an appropriate way, we've provided certainty for 2014 by putting an additional $230 million on the table. And of course, that'll give us the time to provide a more sustainable, a national and fair funding formula for the medium to long term beyond that.
If there is a reduction in funding for some of those states that did sign up, will that come largely out of public schools? Because that's what the states say they've had indicated to them.
Well, we don't accept that that's what the states have had indicated to them. What we're saying is we are doing exactly what we said we would do before the election. We are committed to the same school funding envelope that was put forward by the former government. In fact, we're doing slightly better by putting an additional $230 million.
Are Catholic and independent schools protected under the legislation?
We are obviously, what we've said is that we will put an additional $230 million on the table for 2014, and we will finalise a truly national and fair system for all schools in all states for the period beyond that, and it'll at least be within the same funding envelope that was put forward by the former government.
Okay, the debt ceiling comes to a crunch next week. Is it time to scrap it?
Well, look, I mean, the first point to make here is that we're dealing with Labor's debt legacy. We're dealing with the debt trajectory that we've inherited from the Labor Party. And by putting forward legislation to increase the debt ceiling to $500 billion, we're doing the responsible thing in dealing with a very difficult situation that we've inherited from the former government. And it's quite reckless and irresponsible for Bill Shorten, Chris Bowen and the Labor Party to stand in our way as we're fixing their problems. So that legislation is going back before the Senate early next week, and Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen will have the opportunity to make a judgment in the national interest as to what should happen. Our approach to this is guided by a desire and by a responsible need to provide certainty and stability to the markets and to provide certainty and stability around the financing requirements of the Commonwealth. So we are not prepared to impose a debt ceiling where we know at the time of legislating the debt ceiling it will not be enough to cover the financing requirements of the Commonwealth over the forward estimates. So we are committed to ensure that the Commonwealth does not have to go back for another crack at lifting the debt ceiling over the forward estimates, because I mean that is the way Labor did it. They kept kicking the debt ceiling can down the road. They increased the debt ceiling from 75 to 200 to 250 to $300 billion. In May, at the time of the budget, Wayne Swan knew that by the end of the calendar year, the $300 billion debt ceiling that was legislated would be reached and exceeded. Yet he did nothing to sort out the debt ceiling at that point in time, quite recklessly, quite irresponsibly.
So if I read you correctly, if Labor tries to block your attempts to raise the debt ceiling to $500 billion, would you consider dealing with the Greens in order to scrap it entirely?
Well, I mean, we've noted that the Greens have suggested that perhaps the debt ceiling should be scrapped in its entirety, and what we've said is that we would be interested in exploring those discussions. And of course, I mean, if the Labor Party recklessly and irresponsibly tries to prevent us from lifting the debt ceiling to what is required to deal with their debt trajectory, their debt legacy, then we will have to look at other responsible options to get a majority in the Senate. And if that is the option that's available and which will ensure that there is certainty and stability in financial markets and that there is certainty and stability around the requirements of the Commonwealth to finance its operations, then we'll look at that.
Okay, well, Labor and the Greens also don't appear to be budging, obviously, on the carbon tax. Apart from saying pretty please to them, do you have any other tricks up your sleeve?
Well, I mean, Bill Shorten and the Labor Party went to the last election promising to scrap the carbon tax, and that was after promising the election before that there wouldn't be one. If Labor votes against the repeal of the carbon tax, they're voting for higher electricity prices. They're voting against a $550 saving for families before Christmas. They're voting against strengthening our economy. And really what it would show is that Labor under Bill Shorten has not changed, that Bill Shorten is just a carbon copy of Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, that really he hasn't learned the lessons of the last election. He hasn't listened to the Australian people who want the carbon tax gone.
You're stuck with it though, aren't you, if that's the position they take? Until July, at least.
Well, let's see what position they take. I mean, we know that Bill Shorten would like to scrap the carbon tax. He's just too weak to stare down the left in the Labor Party. I mean, he is going along with the position he's pursuing at the moment because he hasn't been able to get his way within the Labor Party. That might well change. Who knows? Maybe Bill Shorten one day might stand up to the left in the Labor Party in the national interest.
Senator Mathias Cormann, thanks for your time.
Good to talk to you.
After the break, we'll speak to Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Matt Thistlethwaite. Don't go away.